Okay. Hi, I'm Dahlia Lithwick. I cover the Supreme Court for Slate.com, and I think I've been doing it for 15 years. Yeah, no, it's a very strange. This is one of those stories I hate to tell young law students because the implication is just get yourself unemployed. But I graduated from law school. I clerked for a couple of years in Reno, gambling capital of the world. Developed just a tiny gambling addiction that I don't talk about. And then I worked at a law firm. I did family law for a couple of years, and I was not happy, and my ulcer was growing, and I came to Washington literally on my way home to Canada to try to figure out what I was going to do with my life, and someone who called a friend of mine that I was staying with saying, Michael Lewis has been covering the Microsoft trial for Slate, are you interested? And I was like, I don't know who Michael Lewis is, I don't know what Microsoft is, I don't know what Slate is. Sure! I was literally on a futon on my way out of town. And I tried to teach myself antitrust overnight and went in to cover the trial to take over for Michael Lewis. And it was a very strange arrangement because Slate really, I think, was just holding on to the press pass. So they were always like saying, we're kind of looking for a real writer, but you can cover it this week and we'll see what happens. And then I covered it for a couple of weeks and I had a lot of fun and I learned a little bit about antitrust. And then at the end of that, I went home to Canada, and then I got a phone call from, I guess, Jack Schaefer, who was the deputy editor then. He was like, where did you go? And I said, well, the trial was over. I'm going to become a nanny or something. And he said, come back. We want you to cover the court for us. And so that was literally how I got there. And I was kind of lucky because I was certainly the first online person, I think, covering the court. And there haven't been a whole lot after me. So it was sort of an interesting moment, and it was an interesting moment just in terms of being allowed to be there and really, you know, having sort of a front seat at Bush v. Gore and at, you know, all the big affirmative action, abortion, gun cases of the decade, but also just trying to use the online format to find a different voice to cover the court. And so I think it was really, I mean, it's terrible advice, but be on a futon and someone will call. That's my kind of career path, and it really, I wake up every day thinking I have the greatest job in the world. I think that the Supreme Court was, for a long time, had been covered in a very unitary voice, and there was, you know, you can blame Tony Lewis, you can blame Linda Greenhouse, or you can credit them, but I think that there is just a very, very sort of narrow way that the court had been covered. And for me, I think the opportunity to go in there and just try something different, and that someone was going to pay me and give me dental insurance to do that, was amazing. I mean, and I really do think that had I been more immersed in the world of either, you know, real law as practiced in Washington, D.C., or real journalism as practiced in Washington, D.C., I probably wouldn't have been brave enough to just sashay there and like make jokes. I think that just the fact that I kind of, you know, was off the train from Nevada with like, you know, a gaming chip in my tooth and was just so unaware of how irreverent it was or how fixed the sort of rules about court coverage were, I wouldn't have done what I did. I just figured, you know, this must be what everyone is doing. I think almost from the beginning, I mean, I was very lucky because almost, you know, the third week out, Linda Greenhouse came up and said, hi, I love you. You know, I love what you're doing. And, you know, Tony Morrow, Joan Biskupic, I mean, every one of them kind of almost immediately took me in and said, I'm really glad I'm not doing it, but it's so great that someone's doing it. And I think there was, you know, I came at the tail end of what was an interesting moment where people like Tony Morrow were starting to really cover interesting stories about the justices. And there was already a little bit of a fracture in the way we talked about the court. Tony was really interested in, you know, he broke this big story about clerk hiring and minority clerks, and there was some question in the rest of the press corps about whether that was a legitimate story or even a topic that, you know, was appropriate to discuss. So I think already there was a little bit of a sense that we could do this in ways that weren't purely a tracking of the law. And I think really Tony was doing that, Joan was doing it, Nina certainly, Nina Totenberg was doing it. And so I don't purport to have, you know, come in and reinvented a way of court coverage. I think that I came in, and then because I was very, very interested in oral argument as sport, and that's how I treated it. I, from the beginning, said, look, I'm a sports reporter or a theater critic, and my job isn't, what happened in the Constitution today. My job is what happened in this room that you all can't get into because they only, let 20 people have audience seats. And that was always how I approached it. And I think that sense of sort of demystifying both oral argument and the justices as justices, and trying to translate a little bit of what was going on at oral argument to people who might not have been interested. I think there just was a sense that it was time for that, and that there was certainly a space in the sort of swath of what people were doing for somebody to just take a stick and be like, a little bit. No, I mean, I had no background in journalism. My background was almost entirely, all the way through law school. I thought I was going to do children's advocacy. I was of that generation, and there are a lot of us who heard Marian Wright Edelman speak at our commencements and all tracked her, followed her right to law school and said, whatever she does, and I don't know what it is, I want to do that. So I really thought that's what I was going to do all the way through. And I didn't write. I was an English major, but I didn't do a lot of writing, and I didn't think of myself as a writer. I think I probably got through law school doing comedy, not actual comedy, but just everything seemed very funny to me at law school, because law school's hilarious. And so I think that was probably a little bit of a sort of psychological defense that I pulled together halfway through law school, where I was like, oh my God, it just can't matter as much as this matters. So I'm going to just recognize that things that are silly need to be called out as such. And I think that was probably my strategy for at the law firm too, and then kind of carried over into the court. But I think part of me thinks it's just Canadian-ness. I think it might be just bred into us to be a little bit irreverent and a little bit less starry-eyed about the workings of government. It's a very British tradition, right? I mean, I remember one of my first editors saying, what you're doing is very much what, a long, long tradition of British journalists who just walk into the House of Commons and crack jokes. So I think it probably is, I hate to create a cultural Canadian stereotype, but I think there is a little bit of a sense in which if you come at it as an outsider, as with all things, it's a little bit easier to be comic and irreverent. I think that something else was, I think always the humor was a means to an end, and the end is to help folks who don't live in this world to understand why it matters. So I think more than anything, I thought of myself as a kind of science reporter, somebody who, is like, eureka, this thing happened and nobody knows or cares. And if I write the piece that explains to them why this thing could someday, lead to a cure for Alzheimer's, they will know and care. That was always the work. And I think humor is just, I think for me at least, sort of, again, a natural reflex, but also a way to engage people and to say, this isn't complicated, or this is complicated, but let's get through it and have some fun. And so I think the end was always engaging readers who, right on the cusp of thinking this is too hard, or too outside their expertise, or they didn't go to law school. And I still encounter phenomenal amounts of people with BAs who have fantastically interesting jobs who think that the court is too hard. And that, I think, if anything, was always the target. The target was, you need to care. And the fact that there's no cameras in there and no audio, and that there's a handful of us who are accredited to go in there, really creates this urgent responsibility to engage people and to say, this is an issue you should think about, vote about, write letters about. You should care about this as much as you care about local politics, and it's not too hard.